Hi, it's wonderful to be with you all, even if only virtually. And I'm delighted to have the chance to talk to you today about the science underpinning walking. And what I hope to do over the course of the next 40 minutes or so is convince you that this natural activity, which we all engage in, is actually a much more complicated and interesting activity than you would ever have given it credit for. And by the end of the lecture, I hope I will have convinced you also that the word walking is entirely inadequate for the range of things that walking allows us to do and for the range of benefits that it brings us. Now, let's just start at the start. Here's John Cleese from the Ministry of Funny Walks. And there's a quote to go with Cleese and his movement, which is that human walking is a unique activity during which the body step by step teeters on the edge of catastrophe. So this quote is interesting, but it's not entirely correct. Cleese, as you saw during his movement there, was perfectly capable of walking along, extending his head in one direction, moving his limbs in another, nodding to somebody as he walks past them, and yet does not fall over. Of course, he was a member of the Ministry for Funny Walks. So it's not entirely true that step by step we teeter on the edge of catastrophe. Catastrophe is certainly possible, but it's not something that necessarily will occur. Now, let's jump way back in time. We're land dwellers, and for us it seems natural to think that walking first evolved on land. But that's just a landlubber's bias. And we know this because recent genetic studies have shown this not to be correct. How do you answer a question like this about where walking evolved first? Well, what you do is you take bottom dwellers, ones who walk on the ocean floor. Here are a couple of examples. The rosy-lipped batfish, who walks on the ocean floor using the pectoral fins. Or my favourite here on the right, the sea pig. The sea pig is a scavenger, eats waste and detritus and other matter as it moves along the ocean floor. So walking is not at all uncommon at the bottom of the sea. The question is, what is the relationship between the walking that we see at the bottom of the sea and the walking that we see on land? Did walking emerge on land and then creatures went back to the sea? Did it emerge at the margins between the sea and the land? Or did it emerge in the ocean and only later make it onto land? Well, you can approach this question in lots of different ways. One is by fossils, but a more modern method is to focus on genes. And here's a beautiful paper by Jung et al. From 2018. And what they've done is compare the substrates, in other words, the components of the body that are involved in walking on two limbs in a fish, the skate, as you can see it moving along the bottom of the fish tank that it's in, and in a mammal, a four-limbed mammal, the mouse. Now, the last common ancestor of these two creatures existed at about 420 million years ago, according to the calculations of the relevant genetic molecular clock. And the question is, do the genes that control the expression of the limbs, the hips, the muscles, the nerves that are present in the skate, do they resemble in any way the genes that are present in the mouse? If walking evolved independently, well, then they shouldn't share any common components. But if they're the same, or if they're very, very similar, well, then they should share common components. And in fact, they share identical components. The so-called Hox genes, which are involved in the articulation of body segments, and the Fox genes, the FOXP1 genes, which are involved in the articulation, or the control of the development of the articulation of limbs. So these are similar. The genetic programs are identical, in fact, except in the case of the mouse, you have a doubling up, which allows you to innervate forelimbs as well as hind limbs. So the conclusion is inescapable that the program for walking first evolved under the water, on the seafloor most probably, and it had to have been present at least 420 million years ago, which is when the last common ancestor of these two very, very distinct species existed. Now, let's come all the way up to the present and think about how you get up on your own 2 feet. This is something that you're unlikely to have a memory of if you learned to walk in the early years, perhaps up to around 1 to 2 years of age. And it's surprising, but the textbooks of neurology are very silent on how it is that we have learned, or how we do learn, to move about. And here's a wonderful paper by a group in New York, Karen Adolph and her research team. And what they've done is studied how children learn to walk. And you can cut to the conclusion from the title very simply. You perform thousands of steps per day. You have many dozens of falls per day. And that is in its essence the core of how we learn to walk. But that's not enough. You need to know more. So this is how you approach a question like this. You bring children repeatedly to the laboratories, a so-called longitudinal study. You have a gait mat. So this is the mat on the left-hand side of figure A, where the child moves around. And you outrig the laboratory with lots and lots of video cameras. And you track the movement of the child within each walking session and across sessions. And you see that the children in 10 minutes are remarkably active. They move about an awful lot. And what they show in this paper was that 12 to 19-month-olds walk an astonishing amount. They average about 2,300 steps per hour, and they also have about 17 falls per hour. But unlike John Napier's contention that catastrophe awaits when you fall, children tend not to hurt themselves when they fall because they flop back down and sit back up again. It's only if they fall frontally that there's a major risk to them from a head injury. So it takes a very, very long time to learn how to walk, somewhere between about 6 and 12 months on average. There's lots and lots of practice involved every day, but it's a unique skill, different to other skills that children acquire over this period of time. You do not need to be exposed to a walking community to learn how to walk. Unlike learning to speak, you need to be exposed to the natural sounds of language in order to acquire a language. So the motor program unfolds under genetic control and is sculpted by the experience that you have of the environment, but it doesn't require explicit input from other walkers in the way that language learning requires input from other speakers. Now, humans are immensely skilled walkers, or can be immensely skilled walkers, and this is a very good example of so-called rough walking. This is from Mary Hayhoe's lab in the US. And here you have a hiker moving along a difficult rocky trail. And as the hiker moves along the trail, you can see that he's outrigged with a variety of sensors that track his position, including where he's looking and the movements that he's making. Just coming into view is a laptop on his back. And you can see he's moving with actually a great degree of grace and fluidity. Doesn't fall despite the rough terrain, and eventually makes it to the landing point or the end point, and does so very successfully. Well, how do you walk like this? Well, this is how you do it. You walk with a slightly strange stance. You lean a little bit forward. You flick your eyes out about a meter or 2 meters ahead, and then you drop your foot on the position that you've looked at about 0.2 of a second previously. So you make a visual decision, or a decision based on visual input about where you're going to place your foot, and you do so very, very rapidly. This is known as sensory motor integration or visual motor integration. You're looking to a place in space, and then you're making a decision very quickly about where to drop your foot, and you do so stably and without injury. Although, of course, there is always the risk that injury might happen if you land on a position that you've incorrectly judged to be safe. Now, one of the arguments that I make in my book on walking is that walking is good for us in all sorts of ways that we don't really quite appreciate. And it's so good for us that I describe it as a balm for the body and for the brain. So let's unpick that for a moment. One of the things that people will commonly say when they've had a walk is that it was a good walk, they enjoyed it, they feel better as a result of having done that walk. So the question is, how do we know that they enjoyed the walk that they've had? Well, here's a way of thinking about that. You bring students to the lab, and what you do is you ask them to undertake one of two different tasks. First of all, to rate how they're feeling at this moment, and then you ask them to engage in another task, either to walk around a series of buildings and judge what you think the buildings are like in terms of their aesthetic appeal, or to look at pictures of those buildings and do the same. And then at the end of the task, after a period of time has passed, you ask them to rate how they now feel. And what you find is that people who walk to make these judgments feel much better at the end of walking in terms of how they rate how they feel themselves compared to those who've been seated for a similar period of time. So getting up and moving appears to cause positive changes that make you feel a little better. Now, the question is, how do we know that this means anything? So this is a small-scale study conducted with college students. What happens if we look at a much, much larger population? Well, here's a remarkably important study by Samuel Harvey and his colleagues. And what they do is track people over an 11-year period, 34,000 people who do not have any common, quote, mental disorders prior to engaging in this longitudinal tracking. And they do this for 11 years. They don't have any physical health conditions, and they don't seem to have any symptoms of any particular mental health problem. And you ask the question then, what happens in this population over this 10 or 11 year period in terms of whether or not you're going to become depressed? Now, depression is a scourge of modern life. The World Health Organization reckon that by 2025 or so, that it will be the number one cause of mental disability on the planet. So we urgently need solutions for depression. And what this study shows in this very large population is that about 12% of future cases of depression could be prevented if participants walked for about an hour a week. In other words, the dose of movement that people purposefully engage in doesn't have to be very large in order for there to be a marked effect in terms of preventing your likelihood of succumbing to depression. Another way of putting that is that engaging in some regular leisure time activity provides protection against the likelihood that you will become depressed. A really important finding, and one that is probably not sufficiently well understood, that there is a profound connection between engaging in movement and how we feel, and how that engaging in movement inoculates us against the likelihood of depression in the future. Now, it's often said that when you have a difficult or knotty problem to solve, that you should go for a walk. And the question is this true? Well, there's lots of anecdotal stories. Here's a famous Irish mathematician, probably the greatest Irish mathematician, Sir William Rowan Hamilton. He invented quaternions, and these are very, very strange mathematics where the normal rules simply don't apply. So in quaternions, 3 plus 4 does not equal 4 plus 3. It's a really, really peculiar way to think about the world. But quaternions have all sorts of uses in the modern world. Anybody who uses computer games, the graphics engine will use quaternions. Anybody who uses an electric toothbrush, the toothbrush uses quaternions to solve the problems of dual rotation of the toothbrush. And Hamilton used to walk, and walked a lot between Trinity and Dunsink Observatory, a walk of about 11 kilometres. And he used to ponder this problem. And at Broombridge, on one of his daily walks, he realised what the equation for quaternions was. And all he had was his tobacco knife. So he put the equation into a stone on the bridge so that he wouldn't forget it, and went back, of course, with a pen to write it down. And he wrote about this, that when he figured out that you must admit a dimension of space for calculating with triples, that an electric circuit seemed to close and a spark flashed forth. A beautiful way of putting the creative moment, the aha moment when you discover something new. Now, is this peculiar to Hamilton, or is this something that we can all profit from? Well, if we put this in a different way, will walking make me more creative? And how would you know? Well, psychologists have devised a variety of different tasks for understanding creativity. One of them is the alternative uses task. And this turns out to be a very important and predictive task. So in the alternative uses task, you are handed common household objects, and you have to come up with as many uses for these objects as you can within a certain time period. And people vary in their ability to do this. How many uses can you come up with for a brick, for a paperclip, for a can of beans, for a writing pen, for a laser pointer, whatever it happens to be. And people do vary in their ability to do this, and people who congregate in the so-called knowledge professions tend to be much better at generating alternative uses compared to people who do not congregate in those or accumulate in those professions. So a number of years ago, Marileo Pezzo and Daniel Schwartz at Stanford University had the idea of studying this impact of walking on creative idea generation. And what they did was simple but very beautiful. What they did was bring people to the lab and either got them to engage in a period of being seated and coming up for alternative uses, or for a prior period of walking and then coming up with alternative uses. And what they found was that on average, having walked, people generate about twice as many ideas as they might have done had they been seated for that same period of time. And the movement seems to be the thing, because if you do this on a treadmill, people will generate more ideas. If you make them sit on the treadmill, they don't. So actually getting up and moving about engages parts of the brain that may have been quiescent when you're merely seated. This turns out to be a trick that works even in the elderly. So in this study conducted in Taiwan, they compared the performance of people in their 70s to people in their early 20s. And what you find is that the older walking group perform at about twice the rate as the young seated group. In other words, getting up and moving about appears to be a spur to creative, divergent thinking in both young and old, and it's a way in particular to facilitate divergent thinking, especially as you get older. So becoming older or getting older doesn't mean that you'll become less creative. It just means that maybe you need to think about other ways to spur your creativity along, and walking happens to be a particularly good way of doing this. Now, let's talk about how we get around in the world. Those of us who are lucky enough not to be visually impaired would often have a natural sense that vision is the most important way, or the most important sense that we have for navigating the world. And again, let's ask if that's true. Well, here's one way of asking if that's true. You bring people to the lab who are blind from birth, who have become adventitiously blind. In other words, they could see perhaps to their late teens or early 20s, and you compare their performance on a navigation task, a moving about the world task, to people who are normally sighted. So a very common task is what's known as a triangle completion task. You walk two limbs of a triangle and you have to find your way back to the origin. And what you find is that the performance of people who are normally sighted and people who are blind from birth and those who became adventitiously blind is remarkably similar. A really unexpected result, but it turns out to be the case that when these different categories of individual perform the same kinds of tasks, they perform at approximately the same level, at least over short distances. So spatial competence, as they conclude, doesn't really depend on visual experience. Visual experience is important, but the key thing is actually having had experience of the extended spatial world. In other words, again, moving about in a three-dimensional space actually helps build the knowledge of that space, and it doesn't depend on input necessarily from the visual system. And the question then is, what system does it depend on? Well, we see things in the environment and we're able to move to and from them because we can see them. But we have another sense, a silent sense, which is known as the vestibular sense. And this is the system that stabilizes the position of your head in space. So if you think back to John Cleese moving about in the world in the initial slide of this talk, he was moving in quite dramatic ways, throwing his limbs about in all sorts of peculiar ways, but his head remained stable in space. And this is because the job of the vestibular system is to stabilize your head position in space. If you slide, if you slip, any of those kinds of things, the first job of the vestibular system is to recover the position of the head in space so that you can move again. So Alain Berthoz and his colleagues studied this sense using a robuter, as they called it, but essentially an electric wheelchair, where the person was blindfolded, they wore earmuffs, they wore gloves, and they were given movements, triangular velocities and other kinds of velocities, and their job was to reproduce those movements through space. And what it turns out is that actually people's memory for movement is remarkably good, at least over short distances. We are very, very good at recalling the speed with which we have been moved, and we can reproduce that very, very accurately, at least over short time periods and at least over shortish distances. So now we have this remarkable phenomenon where we have a variety of different senses that come together that allows us to understand where we are in the world. The visual system for helping us understand perhaps things that are far away, and the vestibular system to allow us to navigate over short distances. And the two must talk to each other. And the question is, how and where does this information come together? Well, in a study conducted many decades ago now by Edward Tolman in California, Tolman asked rats, or at least taught rats, to run through a maze from the start at position A, through the neck of the maze, and then they would make a left turn, a straight movement, and a right turn to pick up a piece of food at the end of the maze. And then he would trick the rats by closing off the arm that they previously walked through, and they had to figure out how and where to go in order to get the food. So the food continues to be in the same position in space, but the body movements that they need to do to get to that position in space turns out to be different. And what you find is rats, no more than humans, are very, very good at going back to, or at inferring routes to places that they haven't been to before. In the case of the rat, of course, they're very motivated to get tasty morsels of food. So what you have here is a remarkable combination of movement, vision, stabilization of the rat's head as it moves through space, and all of these senses and all of these things must come together in a place in the brain to allow you to engage in navigation through space. The Irish-American neuroscientist John O'Keefe discovered where in the brain this occurs in a very famous paper now, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1971. He recorded the activity of individual brain cells in a part of the brain known as the hippocampus, and he found that the hippocampus had lots and lots of cells that fired just where you are in space. They don't care about where you're going to. They don't care about whether you're sniffing or rearing or chewing food. They fire just according to the place that you occupy in space. And these cells became known as place cells because of this profound correlate that they have with position. And this part of the brain is one of the first parts of the brain to be attacked by Alzheimer's disease. And a common problem with Alzheimer's disease is a loss of orientation in space. People start to not recognize where they are, and they forget what surroundings they're in. They find it difficult to find their way home, these kinds of things. And in part, this must arise because of a disturbance to the cognitive map that we all possess, which is in the hippocampus, which we all have. O'Keefe was to go and win the Nobel Prize in 2014 for this fundamental discovery, and his Nobel Prize was shared with the husband and wife team, Maybrit Moser and Edvard Moser, who discovered a different component to the cognitive map, the so-called grid cells. And these are cells that code for or provide a metric for distance in space. So you have position and you have distance. And there is another part of this navigation system known as the head direction system, which tells you where you're oriented in space. So you put these three things together: position, a metric for distance, and an orientation, and you have the core of a navigation system in the brain that allows you to move around successfully in the world. Now, let's shift the conversation to where we are in the world. It's now the case in 2020 that most people live in urban rather than rural areas, which means that most of our walking will happen in towns and cities. And going along with this is also the phenomenon that everyone is living longer. Everywhere you look, average life expectancy has been rising. So this really has two interesting consequences. We will be walking in cities, and we will also be older while walking in our towns and cities. And this leads to a fundamental problem about how we think about how we design our towns and cities. And it turns out that pedestrian crossing lights are not designed for people who are older. So this is a very important study by Laura Asher and her colleagues in the UK. And what they show in this study is straightforward enough. They did a large and representative survey of adults in the UK aged 65 plus, and they tested them for impairments in walking speed. And what they found was, remarkably, more than 80% of males and females had a walking impairment, and they were unable to walk at the speed that would allow them to cross the road safely at a set of pedestrian crossing lights, because these are designed for younger adults who move more quickly. This is a problem. It means that we've decided, if we don't write this, that younger people and car drivers actually are the ones who matter where movement around our city is concerned, and that the walking difficulties experienced by a significant fraction of the population don't really matter. So we need to think very carefully about the design features of our towns and cities in order to correct this. This is Galway, where I'm from originally, and it has recently had a controversy about one of the roads approaching the approaching the eastern side of the city, and this is the design of this road which has been put in place. You can see the start on the right-hand side of the picture, and the finish on the left-hand side, and the path to be taken by the pedestrian is in yellow. This takes 14 minutes. If you're living on one side of the road and want to get to the shops on the other, there's no crosswalk for you, there's no walkway, there's no direct route. Primacy has been given to road vehicles rather than to movement of the individual. And of course, Galway is an old medieval city, and can't accommodate the volume of cars that are being pushed into it. It's notoriously jammed with cars in the morning and evening rush hour. The alternative, of course, is to provide walkways, cycleways, and public transport that will allow people to get out of their cars. But my key point is that pedestrians and those engaged in individually powered movement are too often ignored in favour of cars. Limerick, 50 miles down the road from Galway, has taken a different tack. You have these wonderful signs everywhere in the city, the so-called walkable neighbourhoods. And surveys show that people in Limerick are surprised that they can walk so quickly between destinations, faster than they might have been able to do had they been driving, in fact. And this comes back to how we think of our cities and how they should be designed. So Erbil in Iraq is the oldest continuously occupied city. Istanbul is, again, a very old city that straddles the Bosphorus. Both remarkable looking cities. Istanbul I've been to visit and is really quite an astonishing city. But the key thing here is that there was no master plan, or not much of a master plan. There might have been small neighbourhood plans, and the city evolves naturally. You have lots of alleys, shops, streets, lots and lots of intersecting corners. And this is one vision, the evolved city. Here's another vision. This is a very 20th century vision by the architect Le Corbusier, who believed that the cities should be designed in zones, that you should have zones for residents, zones for industry, zones for business, zones for parks, rather than an admixture as occurs in a naturally evolving organic city. Chandigarh in northern India is where his vision was most brought to fruition. But Le Corbusier's view of apartment buildings away from other parts of the city has been something that has affected building all over Europe, in fact all over the world. The outskirts of Dublin, the outskirts of Galway, Glasgow, lots and lots of other places have been infected with this view that this is how we should organise our cities. And it comes with a considerable cost in commuting time, in disturbance to people's lives and all of the rest of it. And there's now a bit of a rethinking of this. If you visit Paris, which is, of course is impossible at the moment, there is a new and quite wonderful vision being rolled out, which is the idea that you should have all of the facilities of your town or that you want in a neighbourhood within 15 minutes of your front door, the so-called 15-minute city. And these should all be available to you. So Paris is being reimagined as a walking city where everything is available to you within a short walk from your front door. This means taking cars out, putting cars in their place, turning over streets to pedestrian and cycle and other uses, and making streets into destinations, not into thoroughfares, which is a very, very different way of thinking about how we should organise our towns and cities. This is Taormina in Sicily, and another naturally evolved town. And you can see this wonderful passeggiata that the Italians engage in. And I think this offers a vision for how we should organise our towns and cities for walking, but not just for pedestrians, but for the inclusion of everybody. So I offered the acronym EASE, which stands for easy to walk, accessible to all. That means everybody, people in wheelchairs, people on sticks, or walking sticks, people who who might be on crutches. Every person who wants to move around easily in an accessible kind of way. Cars should be segregated in order to make the spaces safe for everybody, and this should be made enjoyable for all. Now, how much do you walk? Well, the answer is probably not much, unfortunately. We now know that the average adult across the world walks somewhere around about 4,500 steps a day. It varies depending on the country you're in. The Japanese tend to walk the most, for example, at about 6,500 or 5,500 steps per day, something of that kind of order. In Western Europe, it's of the order of 4 to 4,500 steps a day. Saudi Arabia, it's about 3,000 steps a day. And this is because of the lack of walking provision in the cities in Saudi Arabia. You can see within the United States, there's a dramatic difference in the walkability of the cities. New York, Boston, and San Francisco are very walkable cities, so people walk a lot in the morning, walk at lunchtime, and walk in the evening. And they also walk at weekends. Whereas in more car-bound cities, people walk a lot less and they drive a lot more. Now, let's ask the question, one that perhaps you've never considered. Why do we have a brain? Let's put it a different way. What problem does having a brain solve? Trees don't have brains, plants don't have brains, so there's something interesting and unusual about having a brain. This is an animal known as the sea squirt, a very beautiful animal, and if you look at the sea squirt in its early stages of life, it looks like this. It has a spinal cord, it has a kind of an eye, it has a mouth, it has a heart, it has a sort of brain, but it has a primitive spinal cord, and it has a primitive vestibular system where it can tell up from down, so it can protect its underside from predators. And it undergoes an unusual transition during the course of its life. It transitions to being this beautiful creature that we saw just a couple of slides ago, where it attaches itself to a rock, it has a mouth, and it grabs whatever food happens to be floating around. And one of the first things it does is it absorbs its own spinal cord. It ingests its own spinal cord and brain as a meal. This is a really remarkable insight, I think. It suggests that the reason we have a nervous system is so that we can engage patterned movement through the environment. So suppose you're a bit like Homer Simpson and you prefer sitting around. What are the consequences for you? Well, we know that frailty is a very, very common problem in people who are in hospital for prolonged periods of time, for example, where they are unable to move. So how do we study this? Well, this is one way of studying this. You take healthy young adults, you bring them to the lab, and you put them in voluntarily, of course, in a floating bed which supports their body all round for 3 days, and you measure muscles in their legs in a variety of ways, so they haven't been able to walk except to go to the loo for this 3-day period. And what you find is that muscle volume falls quickly, muscle strength falls quickly, and this important property of muscle known as viscoelasticity, its ability to return itself to a position that it was in prior to it being put under stress and strain, drops. So 3 days of sitting around is sufficient to do this. In other words, we all knew this, but being Homer Simpson is not necessarily a good thing for your brain or for your body. And one of the reasons is muscle produces very interesting molecules which have really been studied intensively only in the last 8 to 10 years, known as myokines. These are produced when the muscle is active, not when the muscle is inactive. In other words, the muscle must engage in some form of contraction for them to work. And these migrate all around the body, they travel into the brain, and they build resilience in the brain and body. And many of them have been discovered. More than this though, muscle, and this is important to consider in the times we find ourselves in, is now being recognized as an immune organ that engaging in aerobic activity and also resistance exercise, so lifting weights and things like this, initiates immune activity in the body. And these immune cells can migrate all around the body if you have a healthy circulatory system. And one of the best ways to have a healthy circulatory system is, of course, to get lots of aerobic exercise. And walking is a particularly accessible form of exercise, one that we evolved to excel at. So this will help build your immune response. I'm just going to highlight here something that I'm going to be working on, I hope, over the next few years. One thing that humans do, which is quite remarkable, is walk very, very long distances in the service of abstract ends. And pilgrim walkers in Europe, for example, will walk many hundreds of kilometers along pilgrim pathways, for example, the Camino in Spain. The longest Camino walk is about 1,200 kilometers, and the average Camino walk is about 500 to 700 kilometers. And people do these over a period of days to weeks. And we adapt very, very quickly to this kind of movement. So what we are going to do is recruit people to do an online study through this website, brainpizza.substack.com, where we're going to look at the experiences of individuals who have mobility impairments or disabilities of one description or another, who undertake these very, very long walking or movement related activities. I'm going to wrap up there. Just to reiterate some of the key points of my talk. Walking is actually something that's very good for you. It's something that we don't do enough of in modern life, and it's something that we profit from in all sorts of ways. Some that are obvious, that feeling of well-being that we get after a good walk, but also in ways that are kind of silent to us. We don't know about the legion of wonderful molecules that are being produced in our bodies as a result of movement that build resilience of brain and body. So I'd like to stop there and then just again mention my newsletter, brainpizza.substack.com, where there's plenty of writing at the moment on walking, and there will be more on other related topics to the brain over the coming months. Thank you.